Hello, I'm Arthur Brandwood, Director and Principal Consultant at Brandwood CKC here in Sydney, and I'd like to wish you a warm welcome to our April regulatory webinar. Well, we find ourselves in a global health crisis, don't we? So we're going to take the opportunity to look at the effects of the COVID-19 epidemic on the whole practice of regulatory affairs. And today I'm joined by my co-director and principal consultant, Rob Stringer, who leads our pharmaceuticals team. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks, Arthur, and I'm glad to be here. Today we've got a really interesting topic, given that the world is very much different now than it was 3 months ago. So what we're going to be focusing on here is how regulators have been responding to the changes in the environment. These new and challenging circumstances have forced regulators and sponsors and patients and prescribers to be thinking about operating differently in this current space. What we want to talk about here is, in this environment as well, what do we want to do differently?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? So look, regulators have been planning for pandemics. I know the TGA's had a pandemic plan in place for years, and they've got a lot of existing powers, haven't they? So here's some of them.
Yeah, that's right. Most regulatory agencies, and the TGA is no different to any of the others, they can't suddenly change things in a short period of time, because it takes a long time to build up an appropriate regulatory framework. And so with the forward planning view, when all the legislation was written that enabled the current regulatory framework in Australia, they took into account these emergency situations and created a range of access points that are deemed to be legal within the environment for patients and prescribers to access unapproved medicines. And the legislation is driven by the Therapeutic Goods Act. And this slide here puts a short description of the various sections of the Act and how they apply for access to unapproved medicines. So Section 18 of the Act allows supply through various mechanisms through which the TGA does not have an active role in reviewing the data, the supporting data there. So we have the very popular clinical trials notification scheme in Australia, which is enabled under Section 18 of the Act. There's also supply of unapproved goods through the Special Access Scheme, and this is specifically Category A, where TGA oversight is not provided prior to supply of the medicine. It also gives exclusion from regulatory requirements for personal importation for specific medicines. There's a subsection of the Act there, 18A, which is very much in the COVID-19 pandemic space, which is emergency supply of medicines and importation of medicines which are deemed to be in the national interest. That's really for medicine stockpiling, device stockpiling, to create a process where disaster management and pandemic management can be enabled there without the regulatory situation getting in the way. Section 19 of the Act looks at areas of access to unapproved goods through other mechanisms, but these ones, different to Section 18, are actually have an element of TGA oversight and review prior to the supply of the product. So here you have the clinical trial exemption scheme. Products supplied through that process requires TGA review. You have the Category B part of the SAS, the Special Access Scheme, and also the Authorised Prescriber Scheme. So these are processes where the TGA reviews the supporting evidence for provision of this unapproved medicine and then provides an agreement or a refusal for product to be supplied. And there's a subsection of that, 19A, which looks at temporary short-term supply in the case of temporary out-of-stock situations. And that's an area that's gained particular attention in this COVID-19 situation, where the interruptions to the supply chain and medicines hoarding, unfortunately, from patients has led to significant disruption in that process. So Section 19A is very active in this current space. There's also some other legislative areas that open up other ways for supply of medicines with minimal oversight and that are appropriate in situations where you have a national emergency. And these give power for extemporaneous manufacture of medicines in areas like retail pharmacy, but also the manufacture of therapeutic goods specifically for public institutions like hospitals and research centres and things like that. So this process really outlines the legislative underpinnings of this access to unapproved medicines, which can become very, very important when you have a dynamic situation like a pandemic. But one overarching principle that's behind here is that these products cannot be promoted. So that it's not something that you can put out onto the internet, talk to prescribers or talk to patients about, because these products have not been evaluated for safety and efficacy. So if that's the overall framework that's been in existence since the 90s, when the Act was actually written, Arthur, what's your experience with any new initiatives specifically created in this environment for COVID-19?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So as you say, look, these powers have been around forever, and they were created for both ongoing short-term needs, not in circumstances like today, and also for emergencies such as we find ourselves in. So we've been looking a bit at what TGA has been doing. Here's some examples in the medical devices side, not just devices, the national stockpile as well. So TGA, one power they have is that it's legal to supply medicines, medical devices, any therapeutic good directly to the federal government for the national stockpile. So the Australian federal government maintains a national stockpile of emergency medical supplies, and supply into that stockpile where there's a direct contract between the supplier and the federal government doesn't require a TGA approval. And they're using that power a lot at the moment. As all governments are, they're searching around for whatever supplies they can get and adding them. So, particularly medicines that are in shortage, masks, personal protective equipment, that sort of thing's going into the stockpile. One of the really big issues, of course, currently is IVDs, COVID-19 tests, pathology tests, and a specific exemption that's been written in this crisis is that there is no requirement for TGA review for new COVID-19 tests not currently approved, providing they are supplied to accredited laboratories. That exemption was initially only to public health labs, and now it's to any accredited laboratory. And that means a lab which is appropriately accredited under the NATA scheme. It's audited by NATA. It's got an accreditation to an appropriate laboratory quality system, and it's eligible to make claims on Medicare. In other words, these are the national network of public and private laboratories that currently make reimbursement claims for pathology testing. All of those labs are allowed to arrange for the manufacture and sourcing of tests supplied direct to them to then be used under their supervision without TGA review. So there's a lot of that going on at the moment. Notice there's a couple of nuances here. There's no exemption here for point of care tests unless, again, those tests are being used within the laboratory and not at the point of care. So you can supply a test that's designed for point of care to a lab, and they can use it in the lab on samples brought to the lab. But for actual point of care use, that still requires a TGA approval. And there's no exemption at all for self-testing. In fact, that's been a feature of Australian IVD regulation since it was first brought in the current model, that point of care testing, home use testing for serious diseases is actually not allowed. They are forbidden, prohibited products, and that doesn't look like it's going to change. There are expedited reviews going on. That's the other thing. So TGA is being very proactive in prioritizing the review of new applications for new approvals for devices which are in need in the current circumstances. Primarily, that's around COVID-19 test kits. So people who are wanting to bring in kits which can be supplied more widely than laboratories, they're getting bumped to the top of the queue, and TGA is doing the reviews of those very, very quickly. And it's quite interesting. They are being very flexible about the evidence requirements as well. And we'll come back and talk about that in a bit. Other things like ventilators, masks and personal protective equipment are being dealt with case by case. So the simple message there is if you've got one of these kinds of products where you think there's a justifiable case for a TGA expedited review, let them know, contact them, put your application in, but then immediately follow up. And the right way to do that is by email to the devices@tga.gov.au email address, supplying your supporting data and letting them know that you are requesting an expedited access. That's probably the best way to start the conversation.
And it's had quite an immediate impact, hasn't it? If we look at the number of approvals that have come through in this very short period since the pandemic has been announced, what sort of numbers have we had, say, in the IVD space?
Well, here's a good example of that. Look at this. I pulled this off the TGA website this morning. These are is the list of the COVID-19 IVDs which have been approved. These are new approvals, new inclusions in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods since middle of March. I think the earliest one on this list is the 19th of March. So since the 19th of March, there are all of these, and there must be nearly 20 of them there. I find it interesting looking at this. So there's a whole lot of new devices have been approved. The question I have in my mind is how many of them are actually available, because we look at where they're all coming from. A large proportion of these are coming out of China. Almost all of them, there's maybe one or two are actually coming from Australia here. All of them otherwise are coming from overseas, from Korea, from the United States, and China. And we've seen the sort of chaos that's going on in the international marketplace of people bidding and overbidding and the competition for supplies. So I'm not sure that this long list of approvals actually represents the devices that are available in the Australian marketplace. I suspect that at least some of these, and possibly quite a lot of them, are struggling to get supply into the country.
Yeah, so I mean, creating accelerated pathways in response to a pandemic of the magnitude that we have here is one part. The supply chain's another, isn't it? And that becomes a real challenge here in terms of dealing with this as a public health crisis.
It is, and we'll come back and talk about that as well in a minute, about if you're going to seek a priority access. One of the questions will be about, can you actually deliver on it? So TGA's got their hands full, but they've remarkably done. This is a huge number of approvals to do in that short space of time.
Absolutely. So this gives a good picture on IVDs and what's happening in the broader device space.
Okay, well, I think an interesting one is this. It's ventilators. There's a specific web page from TGA on ventilators, and there's a link there on the screen. And by the way, if you're listening to this webinar, you will receive a copy of the slides later, so you get all of this information and the links. So TGA's got a long page, and I've just quoted one little bit of it, which says this. It says, that off-label use and modifications can be applied to ventilators and to anesthesia machines and other devices in response to the pandemic. Now, normally TGA would not be going around saying it's okay to use things off-label, but they're saying quite proactively here, they accept that there's going to be off-label uses going on, and that might be appropriate. Although you've got to have it in the register for it to be lawfully supplied, they're taking quite a proactive response stance in terms of repurposing of alternative devices such as veterinary devices and rapid establishment of new manufacturing capability. And we've certainly been involved in our practice in some of those discussions with some of the state governments around the place, and internationally as well with some of the overseas agencies on the kinds of requirements. One of the things we do with our devices team here is we've been very heavily involved in biocompatibility, and so got involved in writing standards for safety testing of ventilators. And as a result of that, we've then got involved in supporting some of these new manufacturing. So we've seen a lot of that going on. And it's interesting, look at what's going on overseas as well. So the UK MHRA did indeed just do that. They recently published that guidance on rapidly manufactured ventilators, where they've essentially published a minimum standard for a ventilator. They say on their website, this is not something that would normally be accepted, and it's only for the emergency, but if you can make devices that comply with this minimum specification, then it's okay to use them in the current pandemic. Once the pandemic's over, they can't be used. You have to apply for a proper regulatory approval, but there's a short term. And TGA also references that in its own page, and it also references the FDA guidance, where they've got a whole bunch of supply mitigations we can talk about in a minute, but things like relaxing the requirements on design changes. So it's quite interesting. TGA doesn't have the concept of enforcement discretion that we see in the United States. But here, this is getting pretty close to that. There's a web page that says, well, they need to be on the register, but we understand that right now people are going to be repurposing, and they give a whole lot of guidance on the sorts of things that need to be that should be considered to do that as safely as possible. So yeah, it's sort of enforcement discretion by stealth.
Excellent. Well, the area in medicines is a little bit different. There's been, from as you've outlined there, quite a few initiatives that are relating to some flexibility and some agility being displayed by the regulators around the world in terms of trying to accelerate the access to these medical devices and test kits. It's a little bit more difficult in the medicine space because there's not a large number of levers that regulators like the TGA can truly implement that will lead necessarily to a rapid approval for a new treatment for the drug. Because in the end, it takes a long time to develop the evidence that's required. And unfortunately, that's marked in calendar days, not necessarily related to the amount of effort that's required to do that. And what the regulators want to be very careful with here is not trying to lower the bar too much for treatments in this particular space, or else you can end up with a situation where you're putting the safety of the patients potentially at risk. So the regulators have to juggle that when they're looking at what they can do in the space to facilitate medicine treatments in a time of a pandemic.
See, I was going to say it's quite different to devices, isn't it? So we look at this thing with ventilators here, where we've got, adjustments being made to device designs and so on. There's only so much adjustment you can do with the design of a pill. With a medicine, you've got it's either there or it's not, or you're sourcing it from a different place. So it's a lot less room for maneuver. I get your point.
That's right, and there's not a lot of treatments for viral infections anyway. It's not the same as antibiotics, and so the science is challenging, and so there's not a lot of products that are off the shelf that can be sort of tested to determine their efficacy and safety in this particular space. But there are some, and certainly clinical trial investigations are certainly being prioritised by the regulators to be able to get those trials up and running as fast as possible. But also the knock-on effects of having the pandemic mean that there's a lot of products that are becoming challenged in terms of supply. And some of these are often the everyday type medicines like paracetamol or acetaminophen in the US, ibuprofen. And so what the government there is doing is informally prioritising new supply points and updating of manufacturing sites so that they can try and address these shortages. There's some other administrative areas in the pharmaceutical space where the TGA are pushing some flexibility. And one of the examples there is their current waiving of physical biologicals testing for batch release in Australia. That's temporarily been confined now to a paper-based release, which will mean that there's a lot less faffing about, so to speak, in getting new batches of biological medicines released onto the market here in Australia. So that's one example of one of the administrative supporting functions that the TGA has implemented. However, there is some movement in the space around hand sanitizers. So I think we've got a slide here that provides some information about that. So generally, pre-COVID-19 pandemic situation, hand sanitizers have a number of regulatory pathways available to them. They can, and often that's driven by both the ingredients that are included in them, but also the claims that you're making about the product and what the instructions for use are. So if you want to register a product that claims efficacy against specific pathogens, such as viruses, these types of products need full registration. While it might be an over-the-counter registration, they do need a full conformity assessment, so to speak, before they can be commercialised within the country. And the data requirements for that are quite onerous. There's a series of standards that need to be met, which are based on in vitro and in vivo microbiological testings to ensure that your product does deliver what you say it's going to do. However, those products that are really only making low-level claims, like it kills lots of germs, and are really recommended for use in the consumer setting, so at home or when you're traveling, not healthcare environment. These ones can actually be excluded from regulation by the TGA and have other standards that are applied to those, which are more related to the chemicals themselves that are in them than normal healthcare regulations, so to speak. However, because one of the biggest challenges it's facing here is general hygiene activities, there's a huge call now, an unprecedented call on hand sanitizers here, so huge volumes of the materials. And so the TGA here have passed a new determination, which is the Therapeutic Goods, Excluded Goods Hand Sanitizers Determination 2020. So a long-winded piece of legislation there. It's only passed on the 27th of March. When what this does, it creates a framework where a specified formulation of a hand sanitizer that they know works, and it's consistent with WHO guidances in this particular space, they're actually going to exclude these products from regulatory requirements. And they're quite specific about what they have to have. So on the slide here, we've got the formulation here. It can only be based on an 80% ethanol or a 75% isopropyl alcohol as the active ingredient in an aqueous environment. The only other ingredients it include is sterile distilled water or boiled cold water, glycerol 1.5%, and hydrogen peroxide. No other ingredients can be included in that. So no perfumes, no colorants and things like that. Now that might just be the formula, but there are a range of other requirements that have to be met for you to allow exclusion from regulation. These include the specification for your active ingredients, how you're going to test for your product in terms of content of your active ingredient. There's also manufacturing and record-keeping requirements that are there. Importantly, though, if you can comply with all of these requirements, one of the elements that you don't have to meet is accreditation of good manufacturing practice, so formal accreditation to that. There are also specific labelling requirements as well as the only things that you can say on the label. So this is a big step really for the TGA. And what it has actually enabled is manufacturers who wouldn't normally be in a position to manufacture a therapeutic good, if they follow this formula and they meet these requirements, they now can actually do that, which broadens the manufacturing base for these products dramatically, and also at a local level. So Australia, like a lot of the smaller countries, doesn't have a lot of local manufacture of therapeutic goods in the pharmaceutical space anyway. And this then opens the potential manufacturers up significantly. And the anticipation is that this will see a much more available level of hand sanitizer in the country. So that's one very interesting space where the TGA has been quite proactive in this space. When you look at this process, Arthur, are there other actions like this happening around the world?
Well, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So there's all of this sort of local stuff happening here to get local manufacturing and local emergency sort of actions to move things along quickly. I've been having a look at what the US FDA has been doing. Everybody looks at FDA, of course, they're the biggest of the lot. It's quite interesting. So here's some examples, and they're along the same sorts of lines. So we touched on the ventilators activities. So there's a really interesting part to the ventilators approach that FDA has taken. They have basically said they'll provide emergency use authorizations. Now you still have to apply for the authorization, but the grounds for getting them is a lot easier than the grounds for getting a new 510K approval or whatever that you'd normally require for a ventilator. So they said, okay, we need evidence that the ventilator either meets specified standards, so the normal standards that apply to ventilators. If you can show that through testing, if you've got test reports, then you'll get an emergency use approval straight away. Or here's another interesting one. They're also accepting evidence that the ventilator is approved in another major market, specifically Australia, Japan, Canada, or Europe. So, we've been talking in recent webinars about how TGA is indulging in what's known as reliance, in other words, accepting the evidence of international reviews to then make a local decision here. Well, here's FDA doing exactly that in reverse. So it's quite interesting. FDA is now relying on other regulators for the primary review and saying if it's been reviewed elsewhere in one of these major markets and approved there, then it's good enough to come into the US. In COVID tests, similar sort of thing. They've had 28 separate emergency use application approvals, similar sort of slightly larger number than here in Australia, so 28 separate tests. Some of those are from some of the big name suppliers, some from less well known ones. There's a guidance on lab developed test production. There's 145 labs in the US are producing their own tests and offering them as a testing service under the framework of a guidance out of the FDA. And a couple of new enforcement discretion policies were FDA is putting out quite detailed guidances on clinical thermometers, infusion pumps, personal protective equipment, around what's permissible and what sort of extra wiggle room manufacturers and suppliers have got. Things like changing design specs of devices, changing manufacturing arrangements, changing critical suppliers, without the normal need to go through the sort of long-winded variation applications where you've got to put in a new 510K or a variation of a PMA or whatever for some of these devices. And they're talking in those guidances in some detail about the sorts of things they would agree to. So, you know, what sort of modifications you can make. You can extend the use life or an expiry date or something, things like that. So, and FDA have produced these guidances very quickly. They've published them without going through the normal consultation process. So wham, bam, they're just straight out there. And there's a number of links on the screen there to some of those guidances. So it's quite interesting how that particular regulator has taken a very flexible approach and using its enforcement discretion and saying, well, these things, like TGA has been doing on its ventilators, saying, well, you know, these are the normal requirements, but providing you stick within the parameters of the guidance, then we're going to give you more latitude to change things. So, you know, that's been quite an interesting approach. So, you know, there's a whole lot of examples how TGA here and FDA and others have been trying to be as flexible as possible within their existing framework and with a whole lot of advanced planning that's been done to deal with stuff on the pre-market side. But, you know, there's another side to this, isn't there? There's the post-market enforcement and unfortunately, you know, we've seen some ill-advised and some unscrupulous things going on in a time of crisis. So, Rob, you know, how are regulators dealing with that sort of thing?
It's an interesting concept, isn't it, when we think about the word enforcement. So the regulators are responding as best they can to adjust and be flexible with data requirements in order to meet this global need for treatment in this area. But at the same time, it's still beholden on sponsors and members of the public and prescribers to ensure that they're still playing by the rules. It's not a wild west out there. And unfortunately, we've seen quite a few situations where false claims are being made by sponsors and manufacturers, potentially saying this product will treat your COVID-19, this product kills COVID-19. There's some misinformation that's been going out there. There's quite a lot of correspondence around the world about the rumour that ibuprofen would actually worsen COVID-19 symptoms. And now a lot of the regulators have specifically come out and said that there is no evidence to support that. I mean, the issue with hydroxychloroquine, we even had certain world leaders talking the product up when really the evidence for that product is very, very limited, as is the evidence for intravenous vitamin C, which is another one of the potentially snake oil type claims that are being made. And the regulators are still paying attention to this. They're not allowing this to go through because it can be potentially dangerous for people to believe a product works when it doesn't. And the enforcement processes and the post-marketing surveillance remain unchanged. So that activity is still going on. So we've seen in Australia some specific changes that have been made to actually limit access to certain products. And so the hydroxychloroquine is one, where patients who legitimately needed it in Australia for products for diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis were finding it very, very difficult to source it because of off-label prescribing by general practitioners and pharmacies hoarding the product for potential treatment in COVID-19. So actually updated some of the poisons legislation in Australia to ensure that only patients with a script that has been written by a specialist can access the product at the current time. There's also been products in Australia that used to be able to be provided without access to a doctor, so straight from the pharmacist, such as your Ventolin puffers, your salbutamol inhalers, when now you have to show evidence you have a diagnosis of asthma to stop people stockpiling, which is nothing really related to COVID-19 other than these challenges of patient behaviour and buyer behaviour and the potential problems that we're having with the global supply chains for a lot of these medicines.
So it's a knock-on effect of the epidemic is to compromise other existing patient groups because they can't get their treatments.
That's right. There's even reports in Australia of patients getting into altercations with pharmacists when they're trying to grab product off the shelf and hoard it. So there's processes there where they limit the total number of units that can be provided to any one person at any one time in order to try and balance the supply chain processes. So you see some very poor behaviour from various groups of society, unfortunately, that are probably responding to the fear that a pandemic and a lockdown is having on our population itself. So in this environment, then you have prescribers publishing studies that of questionable value, and you have various members of the public talking up particular products or trying to stockpile these things. So what advice can we give, or can you give to sponsors and manufacturers in these current climates? What are the things that they've got to do to be able to operate in this space and get their products that are needed by patients and society out onto the market?
Yeah, it takes a lot of thinking, doesn't it? So just in terms of all we've just said about how the view from the regulator, they've got their hands very full. The TGA's try getting through the TGA on the phone these days. You'll get an answering service because they're completely swamped, and so many people want to help and are calling up the regulator saying, I can do this, I can do that. Can you please get me on the register quickly because I can help? So I actually thought about, well, what are the sort of things that a manufacturing supplier really needs to consider before they do that? First is really, do you qualify? Do you qualify for any of the current expedited reviews or current exemptions? And the information's all out there on the regulator's website. It's very easily found. So ask yourself, okay, is there a pathway for me? Do you think that you're either covered by one of the exemptions, such as the exemption from approval for test kits if you supply them to a lab, or you're supplying to the stockpile, or you can get an expedited review for something? If you do, before you start charging in and asking for that priority treatment, ask yourself, are you actually ready? Is your device ready? Do you have a completed design? Have you done all your verification testing done? Have you got the clinical evidence? One example there is there's no point going to the regulator saying, I've got a new test kit, if you've still got it in development and you don't have evidence in a robust laboratory validation, at least a laboratory validation, that you can get 90% sensitivity, because that's the current bar for COVID-19 diagnostics. If you can't hit 90% sensitivity, then you're unlikely to get a sympathetic hearing, priority or otherwise. If it's a hand sanitizer, that's a fairly straightforward one. Do you meet the excluded goods criteria? If you're either not making antiviral claims, you're just making fairly low level, kills 99.9% of all germs, that sort of fairly low level claim, then you can go right ahead with that essentially as a cosmetic product. Or you can make it to the formulation using pharmacopoeial grade 80% ethanol or 75% IPA and the other ingredients that, and go ahead that way. It's fairly straightforward. What about the guidances on ventilators and so on? There's evidence there, there's clear guidance there about the sort of minimum things that TGA or other regulators will expect for a ventilator. So do you meet them? Can you make, even if you're not making them in a conventional medical manufacturing facility, can you come up with something that's made and meets these requirements? So if you can't get that far, then you're probably wasting everybody's time attempting to get something through a regulator when you're not ready for it. That's in terms of the device. What about manufacturing? Can you actually deliver it? Have you got your manufacturing under control? Preferably, have you got GMP or medicines GMP or an ISO 13485, and have you got those supply chains secured for your critical components or international suppliers? Because again, there's no point going through an expedited review if you can't actually deliver product to market. And bear in mind, we're talking a substantial scale here. This is a pandemic. There are a very large number of patients needing to be treated or to be tested. I saw the other day Abbott one of the world's biggest manufacturers of IVDs, have got a rapid test available now, and they are scaling up production to be able to make 5 million test kits in a month on month, 5 million a month. And you think that's a very big number, but it just isn't enough. It's not enough for the current circumstances. So, if you're coming along as a small provider and wanting to contribute here, can you do it at scale? Because otherwise, a few hundred test kits is not going to really make any difference. And it's not going to be worth distracting regulators and so on for that level of supply. You've got to be able to scale this up to produce large numbers and make a difference. So ask yourself those questions, and if you believe you've got something to offer and it's then worth going forward, talk to the regulator, but don't waste their time doing this. Do it in a considered way, and only do it if you believe you've got a strongly justifiable case. So TGA, like FDA, like notified bodies, have always had pre-submission arrangements, and they're doing those by telecom at the moment. We've done a few of those in the last few weeks. It's been interesting, and the regulator is being amazingly proactive and amazingly flexible in talking to applicants and triaging and prioritizing things. So it can happen. But what are the kinds of things you're going to be asking in those pre-submissions? So it really boils down to several key points. Firstly, clarifying what's the appropriate regulatory pathway or application exemption. Do you qualify for it? Which way should you be going? That's a thing that can be cleared up in a telephone conference with the appropriate reviewers at TGA. What is the TGA's expectation to evidence requirements? As I said before, they're being far more flexible at the moment, letting things through that normally they wouldn't consider, or normally they'd take a much more considered approach to over many weeks or months with formal information requests and all of that sort of stuff. For diagnostic tests, often they would have preferred to have full clinical evidence, full clinical trials, but now they're saying, okay, we'll take good, robust laboratory studies that hit that 90% sensitivity level, being more flexible about it. And sometimes doing things in parallel. Okay, you've got the test data, if you can, and you've got plans to set up the manufacturer, get on with it, make your submission now, and then we'll look at what your manufacturing is as soon as you've got it set up. So, there's a lot of that sort of discussion going on. But the key question here is fundamentally, it's that old regulatory adage, in God we trust, all others must bring data. Are you ready to bring data? Because if you've not got evidence that you've got something that works, that's properly designed, that's been tested, you've got clinical evaluation, and you can make it and supply it in the scale that you need it, then stand out the way. I think it's the simple answer.
Well, that's right, isn't it? Because the regulatory environment is still the regulatory environment, and we need the data to have quality products to be out there. And so, it's great to see the regulators being agile and flexible in the approach that they're taking, and really working in a partnership approach with manufacturers and sponsors of therapeutic goods, so that they can do their very best to remove any unnecessary barriers to products coming out onto the market. But same token, you've got to have quality products, and so that's why the data remains a key component. So it's a really fascinating time we live in now, and we'll probably have quite a few months ahead to see how this pans out. So thanks very much for your comments there. I hope that broader listeners here found this presentation useful. We have one more slide here which provides some more information and some links that will be active on the set of slides that you've received, looking at the latest information from the various regulators around the world, and hopefully that'll be useful.
Yes, and we will make the slides available, of course, Rob. So everybody who's registered and has got this recording, you should also be able to download. You'll have received the link to download the slides, so you can get all of the links in the downloaded PDF. And on the right of the screen here, we will be maintaining our blogs. That's a screenshot of the blog page this morning. You can see there are 4 blogs right up there at the moment on what's going on in response to the pandemic. We'll be actively updating that, putting up new blogs and updating existing ones as circumstances change, and they are changing day by day. So we'll do our best to keep that as current as we possibly can. So just keep coming back. Check the links on the screen. Check the website at the link there.
Yeah, and of course, as always, if you have a specific question for either of us or anything that Brandwood CKC can assist you with, please reach out and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So the email address is at the bottom of the slides here as well. So it's help@brandwoodckc.com.
Pretty easy to remember, help@brandwoodckc.com, and that's monitored all the time, and we'd certainly come straight back to you if you write to us on that. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe, stay at home if you can, please, and we'll look forward to welcoming you again to our next webinar.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Goodbye for now.